Oh, a nice warm day today. Well, actually, it's really comfortable. It's just going to be warm in this room.
Without the cool air, blowing into our impromptu studio here, it's it's going to be a bit warm, but okay.
It was either that or, cars constantly going by. So.
Absolutely.
All right.
So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, since this is coming out the week right before the 4th of July, I thought we'd talk about another major American military victory that happened here.
Yeah, during the American War for Independence.
One that we couldn't cover last year, but the very important one. So we're going to talk about Saratoga.
Saratoga, yes, the crucial American victory.
Welcome to Unearthly Upstate. I'm Mari.
And I'm Matthew.
And like I said, subject of today's podcast will be the victory at Saratoga. We are also going to discuss some interesting ghost tales that come out of there, and some interesting facts that I didn't know until researching this. We are going to discuss as well.
Okay, now, what's the haunting aspect of this story?
There is a trail. We've gone to the national park.
Yes, we have been to Saratoga,
we have
as a matter
been
of fact.
We didn't go many of the hiking trails because the day we were going was a April day, cold and drizzly. So we stayed on the auto trail. In fact, we missed one thing I really wanted to see because it required to get out of the car and go down this path.
Yep.
So we have to go back so I could see this particular thing. But we did see quite a bit. But there is a walking trail, hiking trail, horse trail they have there. I forget the name of it, and I'm really sorry. I'm sure it's in my notes somewhere. It'll come up. Where people hear gunshots. Well, in that area that might not be paranormal. It is a rural area.
There's a lot of rural acreage there, a lot of private land, and people do go hunting year round.
Right.
Yeah.
So they hear gunshots, they hear yells, they hear basically sounds of the battle. And the interesting thing is the one ghost that people normally see is a black man wearing the colonial uniform. And I found that interesting. That's actually going to lead us to a little sidetrack we're going to talk about.
Now, who claims to have seen it? Is it just people in general?
A few people.
Okay.
There is a story behind it. We'll go back to it later.
And this is the only sighting of a ghost
that I could find. There's probably others, but that was the one that most people agree upon that they see when they go there. Is this one particular one? I'm not sure if they see him on that same trail or not, or if he's seen at some other part of the park. But as we know for volunteering at Fort Stanwix, there can be things that happen at these places that you may put down as paranormal. I mean, this was a major battle site, so if it's going to be haunted, it definitely will be haunted. It's gorgeous, though. It's right. Oh, the Hudson's beautiful right off it. So, okay, anyway.
All right. Well, to go on, a crucial American victory in Saratoga, autumn of 1777. American forces met, defeated, and forced a British army to surrender. This crucial American victory renewed patriots' hopes for independence, secured essential foreign recognition and support, and forever changed the face of the world. Now, before I go on any further, I'd like to give you an article I wrote myself about the events leading up to the battle, and that's about the defense of the Oneida Carry. The possession of an essential territory such as the Oneida Carry meant the rebuilding of Fort Stanwix to assist the colonial forces fighting for independence from the British Crown. In the year 1777, the Battle of Oriskany and the siege of Fort Stanwix historically marks two significant engagements indispensable in the setting of the stage for the Battle of Saratoga. We can get into the battle itself. First, a little bit of the background. Now, since the opening shots on April 19, 1775, that was the April morning of Lexington and Concord. Now, the British had wanted to bring an end to the rebellion quickly. Burgoyne had believed since his 1775 arrival in North America that the Lake Champlain Hudson River Valley was, quote, precisely the route an army ought to take, unquote. Now, should the invasion become necessary, but that belief formed the backbone of the British plans to invade New York. Daring scheme to utilize 3 separate armies in an effort to isolate New England, the perceived heart of the rebellion, and the focus on crushing that seat of discontent. The large army of about 10,000 soldiers, Native American allies there, you got Loyalists, you got camp followers, and others, were to invade south from Canada into New York, making their long way along Champlain, the Hudson River. They would continue south, eventually reaching Albany. Once in Albany, they would set up winter quarters and open communication lines within the city to New York. A second British army led by Colonel Barry St. Ledger, we've gone over this guy before, to depart from Lake Ontario and invade eastward into New York. Upon arriving at the Mohawk River, they would follow it to its confluence with the Hudson, somewhere in that area, and they were to rendezvous with Burgoyne's forces. Now, we know because of the siege of Fort Stanwix and the Battle of Oriskany and the threat of Benedict Arnold marching his column up country, it just threw St. Ledger's plans right into the soup. And he himself escaped in the night, literally. He just booked. Left his sappers digging trenches towards the northwest bastion of Fort Stanwix. And that was the situation that ended there after days of siege and the Battle of Oriskany. The army led by General William Howe and his British troops in New York City were the third element in the plan. They would push northward into the Hudson Highlands, capturing a few forts in the southern part of New York and giving American defenders near Albany the appearance of being invaded from both north and south. Now, the American forces would, in theory, have no choice but to divide and address both invading armies at the same time, splitting their forces. And it was hoped that a smaller American force facing Burgoyne would, prove little of resistance, and a small American force further south would become stuck between then British and Albany, between then British-held Albany and British-held New York City. Now, Howe realized a potential flaw in the plan, and the American General George Washington, whose forces had been chased out of New York City the year before, were somewhere in the northern part of New Jersey. If Howe proceeded northward into New York, Washington could conceivably retake New York City, and his solution was to attack Philadelphia and draw Washington's army out into the open. And, of course, Howe needed to keep New York City in British hands, of course, during all this time. And so he left his second-in-command, General Henry Clinton, with several thousand men to hold the city and to proceed with the push into the Hudson Highlands. And by August 1777, Burgoyne had successfully captured Fort Ticonderoga, defeating the fleeing American troops at Hubbardton. That was in Vermont. His army would stay at one of these, that was Fort Edward, on the edge of the river, remaining there for a month. That's in August. Burgoyne sent a contingent of about 800 of his rented German troops.
Rented Germans. Okay. God.
Okay. These guys were marching toward Bennington, Vermont, only to lose these men to American militia soldiers in a battle on the New York side of the border. They didn't even make it into it. And so in early September, Burgoyne's army began their southernward march again. They marched on the Old River Road, while many of the supplies were floated on boats down the Hudson. The northern department of the American Army, commanded by General Horatio Gates, was keeping busy with his own preparations. Now, starting on September 12th of that year, they began to build formidable defenses on Bemis Heights. This ridge of bluffs 2 miles north of the village of Stillwater overlooked both the Hudson River and the River Road. Defenses at Bemis Heights were formidable indeed. Cannons there could hit the river, the road from fortified lines on the floodplain. The natural bottleneck in the river valley would funnel the British right into the American gun sights. Nor could the British go east around the position, for the rough terrain there and lack of good roads prevented much movement. Okay, knowing all this, the 8,500-man American Army also built a long fortified wall about 3/4 of a mile west of Bemis Heights and then 3/4 of a mile south, forming a large L-shaped line. This combined position, defended with 22 cannon, were well suited to deter British from invading any further. Now, the British, by now, had crossed to the west side of the Hudson, were only days away. Now, coming to the Battle of Saratoga. On September 19th, 1777, General Burgoyne, commander of the British Army, split his 7,500-man army up into 3 columns near Saratoga. One column would march west about 2 miles inland and began moving south, and the second column would move about a mile inland before moving south, and then the third column, made up of German troops, moved along the river road, the aforementioned river road, in defense of the British supply lines. Now, about noon on the 19th, scouts from the center column encountered Colonel Daniel Morgan's American light infantry and riflemen at the farm of John Freeman, a loyalist who had gone north to Fort Edward to meet up with Burgoyne's army. Okay, the fighting began, and which grew fierce, as the battle swayed back and forth, each side taking and losing and then retaking the field. As evening drew closer, Burgoyne ordered about 500 German soldiers to move from the river to reinforce the British center column. When the Americans heard and saw them coming, because their cannons commanded the view, they were able to see, and they left and fled and returned to their own lines. The British held the field, but were unable to proceed. Now, on September 22nd, Burgoyne got word from Clinton that he could send troops north from New York City at any time, and Burgoyne expected assistance and ordered his troops to dig in and wait for support from Clinton. But time wore on, and it was clear that Clinton's men weren't going to arrive. By the first days of October, Clinton's men had moved northward. They captured some positions, but they had to quit. Clinton was ordered back to New York City. Now, Burgoyne's army grew short on time, supplies, and manpower, and their now 6,800-man army had been on half rations for the last 2 weeks, and winter wasn't far away. On October 7th, he sent out a 1,500-man reconnaissance in force with several cannons to probe and bombard the American left, and the group was delayed in Barber wheat field. Some of the soldiers were tasked with harvesting the much-needed ripened wheat. Around mid-afternoon, the Americans, aware of the British movement, attacked. Their now 13,000-man army was able to push the British back. As the British withdrew, Simon Fraser, a high-ranking officer, was mortally wounded by the Morgan riflemen. Why is it significant to mention Simon Fraser? Well, because by this time, the activities of the riflemen were causing, day by day, the British to have at their disposal fewer and fewer officers. So, British forces hastily fell back to one of their defensive positions in the Balcarres Redoubt. It was strong, well defended, and able to deter the Americans. Several hundred yards north, the Bremen Redoubt was not as well suited to defense. It was also defended by less than 200 German soldiers and officers, no match for the nearly 1,300 American soldiers sent to attack it. Now, as some of the American troops began to circle around the left side of Bremen Redoubt, American General Benedict Arnold arrived on the scene. Caught up in the flow of American soldiers, he rallied the men and was seriously wounded in the left leg. Yep. Interesting story about Benedict Arnold's leg.
Yes.
Okay, we'll mention that later.
We have to come back to his leg, yes.
By nightfall, the Americans held the Bremen Redoubt. As it was at the far right of the British lines, they could then get behind the British anywhere else from behind. Now, they did not press the advantage, but the British still fell back to their own river fortifications at the Great Redoubt. Simon Fraser was buried at the Great Redoubt the morning of October 8th, and having picked up what supplies they could, Burgoyne's army began a hasty retreat north. With scant rations, they trudged through cold, rain, and mud until reaching the village of Saratoga, namesake of the battle. There they found themselves boxed in by American militia to the northwest-east of the village. They set up a fortified camp and waited. 2 days later, the Americans had completely surrounded them. After a week of negotiations, Burgoyne surrendered to Gates on October 17, 1777. The American victory demonstrated that American troops could fight the British army on their own terms and win. It also convinced the French allies to come in on the American side and declare war against their ancient enemy, the English. Sometime later, the Spanish, the Dutch also followed suit. This multinational alliance turned a civil uprising for the British in the Americas into a world war, as they would have to fight not only in North America, but in the Caribbean Sea, Mediterranean, North Africa, and South Africa, and India, just to name a few. Now, during this worldwide conflict, Britain won significant engagements against its enemies, yet lost the fight for North America. Because of the incredible impact caused by the American victory in the battles of Saratoga and Oriskany, with the siege of Fort Stanwix thrown in there respectively, are known as the turning point of the American Revolution and are considered by many historians to be among the top 15 battles of world history.
Yeah. Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
St. Ledger was supposed to be in this battle, right?
Well, yes, after he successfully quashed Gansevoort at Fort Stanwix, supposedly.
Which he didn't do.
Which never happened.
Yeah.
It never. The plan, that's why Saratoga was such a debacle for the British, is because of St. Ledger's failure at Fort Stanwix and the draw at the Battle of Oriskany. The British claimed victory at Oriskany, but actually it was more or less a draw because everybody lost out in a big way somehow.
Yeah.
The people defending Fort Stanwix lost their relief column. The native allies of the British lost their encampment. They got looted while they were away fighting down in Oriskany. And Benedict Arnold was on his way. Boy, that was enough to make Barry St. Ledger steal away in the night. After 21 days of siege.
Now, the thing you got to remember, so many people think Benedict Arnold was a traitor. That was later. At this point, he was a very up-and-coming officer.
Very successful.
Very successful officer. And, yes, we have to talk about his leg. Remember I said I wanted to see something at Saratoga, and it was too rainy and cold to go down the little path to see it. It's the, I'm putting air quotes up, grave site of his leg. Actually, his leg's not there. No. But it's a little monument. It's a monument to his leg, which was shot at Saratoga.
His left leg.
So that was one thing we didn't get to see in Saratoga. We did see, I believe, that one farmhouse. My memory can't serve me right now. There was a farmhouse that was taken over by the colonists.
It's still there.
It's still there.
Yeah.
You can, literally a one-room farmhouse. And that became basically, that was the headquarters of the colonials at that time. When you get a good view of where this battle was taking, I think a lot of people forget that these battles were not taking place in big, wide, open fields. Now, a lot of Saratoga is big, wide, open fields, but there is a lot of woods there as well. I mean, we saw more deer, I think, going through Saratoga that day. There was a whole herd. There was a whole herd running through there. But it gives you an idea. There's a lot of woods. There's a lot of open space. But it's not these nice open fields like you envision, like for the Civil War. I mean, I think some people have gotten the idea that these battles took place.
Not like Gettysburg or Antietam.
That they only took place in open areas. And some of this was open area, but a lot of this was you're fighting in the woods. A lot
of this was fierce hand-to-hand fighting in the woods like in Oriskany.
Yeah. Well, on top of the Civil War, I don't think I didn't see a Civil War movie that showed fighting in the woods until Glory. There might have been others, but that was the first one I saw.
During the Peninsula Campaign.
Yeah. They were in in the forest fighting. So, just to give you an idea, and it's a huge battlefield, huge. It takes a good 3 hours? 3 hours to drive through it if you go stop at every place.
If you listen to the timeline that I related to our listeners, this thing takes weeks. To pan out.
Yes.
We're talking August to October. By the time that he finally surrendered.
Yeah. Now I'm going to bring up a little.
So it takes a long time.
A little interesting fact here. Remember, I said the one ghost that people see is a black colonial. And that led me to wonder how many soldiers were African. I can't say African American at this time. Okay, that's just the wrong term at this time period.
Those terms were not used at this point.
Now, the first casualty was Crispin Attucks, who was two things. He was either a free man or he had ran away, but he was working as a rope maker in Boston, and during the Boston Massacre, he was the first one shot and killed. So the first person killed in the American Revolution was a black man, which I think is a fact a lot of people don't realize. And how many of these? How many total soldiers were there? How many on the British and how many on the American?
Thousands. They started out with 10,000 soldiers, and that includes Native Forces, Loyalist camp followers, and also rented army from Germany. Marching into Saratoga, Burgoyne had 7,500 troops.
Now, There has been some research. They haven't got exact numbers yet, but there was anywhere between 400 to 600 of those troops between both sides were black. At this particular time, on the colonial side, they were enlisting, but they weren't. They could only be soldiers. They could not serve as staff or commissioned officers. It didn't matter what their status was. They could be freemen or slaves. If they were going to enlist, they could enlist. When they needed more men, by 1779, Congress decided, well, first George Washington was like, I need more men. Let's sign up more men. And then Congress decided in 1779 that they were going to grant freedom to any slave who enlisted, and even paid them $50, which quite a good money back then. The regiments were unsegregated at that point. I believe it's the Rhode Island. Rhode Island had a regiment that was one of the first. It was predominantly black, but it still was not unsegregated. It wasn't the black regiment, but it was just.
And there were no segregated units during this time. They all served together.
Exactly. And then what's interesting too is the British had theirs as well, but it was considered good luck to have an African drummer. It was one of those weird superstitions. So they would enlist a lot of black musicians to come along. So before 1776, Lord Dunmore, who was the governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation that declared any slave who escaped and joined the British Army would be granted their freedom. And he ended up with 800 soldiers when he made that announcement. His Ethiopian regiment, unfortunately, was decimated by smallpox. The British were encouraging the slaves to run away because they wanted to remove any skilled slaves from American hands at that point. So there was a lot of reason why they wanted them to enlist. The Continental Army did not allow African Americans to serve, but there were exceptions. Those who had served since the early days in 1775. So probably at this time in Saratoga, that was if there were any black soldiers among the ranks of the colonists, they had been there since 1775. So they had been there prior to the Declaration. New recruits were not allowed to come in, and then that led to the Dunmore leading his proclamation to try to change that. Right. Okay, I hit it back up a little bit. By 1781, the Continental Army was nearly 1/4 African American in Yorktown, and again, we have to state that they were not segregated as later on they became segregated. So that wasn't even a thing right then. So the reason I bring this up is it did actually surprise me. I knew there were black soldiers. I mean, they were Prussian, they were German, they were Scottish, they were Hessian, many different nationalities that were fighting on either side. A
lot of men wearing different colored shirts pulled from all four corners of the globe.
Right. So that wasn't a big surprise to me. But what's surprising was how it's not talked about a lot. And I don't know if it's just an assumption that people were making at the time that there wasn't this involvement, but there was.
I think if people understood just how involved everybody was in the war for independence, I think the general understanding would improve. Of its time and place.
I cannot find the notes, but the story in The Ghost is he may have died of friendly fire, which
was common.
I don't think there was anything malicious in the ghost story. There's nothing to say that this was a malicious attack on this particular soldier, but just that where he just happened to get shot by another person in the regiment. 7, they're very famous. One was an African-American female poet, too, but she didn't actually serve. She did a lot of letter writing. And
the role of women, too. There is a camp follower who is, by some historians, credited to be the one of the first war correspondents. Because she wrote everything down.
Yes.
That happened.
Yeah.
And as a camp follower, she overheard conversations, talked to people in the know to find out what was going on, and also the events that she herself was involved in.
Perhaps we need to define what a camp follower is.
That is a person who is a member of a family of either a soldier or an officer. The families of as many soldiers and officers came along with. They trailed behind the Army.
That practice died off in the Civil War pretty quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, it sure did.
Yeah.
Because of, well, it's very dangerous. Mm-hmm. Particularly if your side should lose.
Yeah. If
you get caught by the opposing army. Mm-hmm. And it's found out that you were following the troops of the defeated force. I don't know. I don't know what happens to you.
Yeah. Well, not only that, the reason I heard it dropped off really hard, fast in the Civil War, was during one of the early battles. Mm-hmm. They set up like they normally did. Yeah. But the guns had improved greatly since the Revolution.
Oh, my goodness sakes, yes. Rifled, cannon, and...
Yeah.
And just
so
generally
the camp followers set up like they did, supposedly safe away from the battle, but once those bullets started flying, they were in range.
Yeah.
And it became very dangerous. I mean, people were still taking families out to watch these battles as entertainment up to this point.
First Battle of Bull Run was they had a big picnic there.
Yeah.
And then once the Union Army started to beat its retreat for the Battle of First Bull Run, then everybody who came out to see it, all the spectators were choking many of the lanes.
Yeah.
And preventing the Union Army from actually retreating away from...
So you step back to the Revolutionary War, you still you don't have the rifled, or you have some rifled, but not...
You have, generally, the 3-band Enfield was the weapon of choice for both armies. And this had a rifled barrel. This put a spin on the bullet. If you know something about firearms and what rifling is, then you'll know. But the rifling, or the spiral groove that's made through the manufacturing of the gun, that spiral groove in the barrel puts a spin on the bullet and makes it that much more accurate than a smoothbore musket. This made for a much more deadlier weapon, and the cannons were the same. They weren't smoothbore either. They had riflings as well, so you had even more accurate artillery for the big guns. And so, increased range, too. The tactics of the time were still Napoleonic. You see photographs of when the camera crews went out there later on, after the battle, during the Civil War, and taking pictures of just ranks of men lying on the ground. They weren't placed there like that. They weren't placed like that after the battle. That's where they died, in rows, like that. No. Towards the end of the war, they revised their tactics somewhat.
But then you back up again and go back to the American Revolution. That was just the beginning of that, the rifling and that.
Oh, yes. And
so they could,
Morgan's rifles.
Yeah, they could still fight Napoleonic style, which was basically you had the one row get on their knees, the other row above them, both fire, fall back, the next 2 rows move up, which was pretty common.
That was one tactic.
Yeah. That was a pretty common tactic.
And you have skirmishers with rifles as well, dedicated riflemen in dedicated rifle units like Morgan's at the Battle of Saratoga, who went around picking off officers and artillerymen to such a point where the riflemen were actually able to take possession of the British guns for a time before the British would come back and take them over again. And it was this constant back and forth. Lots of that going on during the Battle of Saratoga.
Speaking of battle, we have 2 cats back here and they're eyeing each other up, so apologize for any cat fights we may have. Anyway.
Any cat fights we might have.
I feel like we talked about everything in Saratoga. I want to say we missed something, but, there is something we could talk about. In the history books, this was a big victory. I mean, it wasn't until Cornwallis's surrender that it was over, and that was a few years later. The British were, give them credit, they were one of the best armies of the world at that time. And here is a bunch of farmers and allies. We're just getting organized. We're just getting the training they needed to be a good military, and they totally got them at Saratoga. I mean, think about it. I mean, there's that meme I share so often, it was like, who would win? One of the strongest, most well-trained armies in the world, or a bunch of farmers with old weapons? It's a little exaggerated, but that's kind of what you're looking at.
For the colonials at the Battle of Saratoga.
Right.
They had them outclassed in numbers right away.
And of course, St. Ledger never made it, so he didn't.
Never made it.
He never brought his in.
That plan never came to fruition. That part of the British plan to split the colonies never happened because of lack of planning.
So the park, it was established there as a National Historic Park. It was first listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1966, so it was officially notified as it's as old as you. There you go. Oops, I shouldn't have said that. You can cut that out. And there are a lot of buildings they did save there, of course. The monument obelisk, it's got statues of the American commanders, Gates, Schuyler, and Daniel Morgan. And yes, it's Schuyler, not Schuler. We got schooled in that. If you look at the spelling and you don't remember it's German, it's going to look like it says Schuler. Schuyler. It's Schuyler. Now, there's supposed to be a fourth statue there, which is where Benedict Arnold was supposed to go. After the events in Saratoga, things didn't start going well for him. And he started getting overlooked for commissions. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what happened with him. His mistress, wife, girlfriend, I can never remember what their relationship was kind of goading him into joining the British. And eventually, her working on him, and he keep getting him overlooking.
She was bitch shaming him into
you watched Drunk History,
taking the step.
Yeah, and he was being overlooked for promotion, so and that's what led him to the British. And from one respect, I can totally understand him doing that, and from another, you just gotta wonder. Yeah. How many people were influencing him other than just her? So he went down as one of her first traders, and they never put a statue up, but they do have his memorial to his leg. There.
Yeah, some after the battle, some patriots remarked that Benedict Arnold left the best part of himself at the Battle of Saratoga.
And actually, that particular statue was donated by Civil War General John Waite de Pasteur. I hope I said his name right. It has a boot with spurs and stars on it, and it stands where he lost his leg. This is the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army. You can't deny that he was brilliant. So, whatever personal reasons led him to switch sides, we can debate later, but yeah. 6 National Guard units that are derived from American units that participated in the Battle of Saratoga, and there are now only 30 units in the Army which have lineages back to Saratoga. So that's quite great.
Here's a part of the article. The battlefield and the site of Burgoyne's surrender have been preserved and are now administered by the National Park Service as the Saratoga National Historic Park, which was listed on the National Register of Historic Places.
And then, of course, in the Navy, we also have the USS Saratoga. We have a few of them. There's been a few ships named that. And I even think there's a Star Trek ship named the Saratoga, isn't there?
Oh, of course there is. Yeah.
Of course.
Okay. Well, the aftermath. Burgoyne's failed attempt marked a major turning point in the war, and John Burgoyne returned to England and was never given another commission. The British learned that the Americans would fight bravely and effectively, said one British officer. The courage and obstinacy with which the Americans fought were the astonishment of everyone. And we now become fully convinced that they are not the contemptible enemy we had hitherto imagined in them, incapable of standing a regular engagement, and that they would only fight behind strong and powerful works.
There's a couple other interesting points here. Gates became so popular after the attack, after the battle, that some people wanted to replace Washington with Gates, and which I found interesting. But our first Thanksgiving, not the one that is celebrated in myth and that, but the first one officially declared, was actually a celebration of Burgoyne's surrender. And it was declared on December 18th, 1777, as a national day of solemn thanksgiving and praise. So it was a Thanksgiving, but a Thanksgiving that we thank everybody we won. Yeah. That's the interesting part of it. But as for it being haunted, since we've been there, what's your view of it being haunted?
I'm not the one to ask.
I do know when I was looking up ghost stories and haunts, there is one person who's basically posted on every board he could find almost he must have wrote it out as a rant, copy-pasted it, basically, how he found it offensive that people were discussing ghosts at the battlefield.
Oh, really?
And I take umbrage with that, sir, for many reasons. Even if you don't believe in ghosts and you think it's all hogwash, if that's what gets somebody to the park, if that's what gets somebody to the museum, and they learn something that day, what should it matter?
Yeah, come for the ghost story, stay for the history.
Exactly. I mean, I always like ghost shows that are more about the history than the ghost. Give me that nice, solid background. Don't just say, oh, in 1823 a murder happened here, and now look, we're going to the investigation. Oh, geez, sorry. Let me do that again. They don't say, oh, in 1823 a horrible murder happened here. Now let's go to the investigation, and it's about an hour of people going, what's that, what's that, what's that? I hate those shows. But if you give me a show which goes, okay, here's the history. Yeah. And as they're going through the spot, you kind of get a history tour with it.
Exactly, yeah.
I find that far more interesting. If they find a ghost, fine. If not, I've learned something about this place. Yeah. And maybe it's all folklore. I don't care. You've learned something about this place.
There's a lot of ground out there in Saratoga for the two battles. I'm talking about any battle. Has got to be fertile ground for hauntings.
Yeah.
There may have been, people may have had experiences there at the battlefield and never related them, never bothered to tell anybody else about them.
It can be quite foggy there, because the day we were there, it was cold and drizzly, and there was a lot of fog, so it does seem kind of ethereal.
It did seem, it gave it an eerie sort of atmosphere.
Until that one ridge above the Hudson there, and we had lunch by the...
Where they had the British guns.
With the British guns, It cleared up amazingly then, but up to that point, it was kind of spooky. And you wouldn't expect that weather in April. I mean, it would have been more fitting in October, but we were experiencing in April that day. And that's also why we learned how to...
I'm just amazed at the amount of ground that these men covered just on foot,
right,
in such a short period of time. They must have just been running.
Oh, gee.
One end to the other, side to side, back and forth, that sort of thing. Seemed to be the way the Battle of Saratoga ran.
Yep. Well, I think we pretty much discussed it. There's a lot more to it. We could have probably broke this down to 3 episodes if we wanted.
Oh, yes, we could have done that.
Easily.
Starting with the events leading up to Saratoga, and then separating both battles, in one for the farmhouse and the other, and then dealing with the aftermath and what happened, and then going into detail about the personalities involved. And a lot of, not just the major personalities, but a lot of people on the fringes, too.
We might revisit. Probably not this season, but we might come back to Saratoga later, because there are a lot of interesting things up there. But I'm just seeing what we have scheduled for next week and see if it's something interesting. Because I know we did a lighter one last week, because we did 2 heavy ones at the end of season 4.
Oh, yeah. People just eat that true crime up.
Well, I'm not sure what one we're doing next week. I got a few things here. I'll just give you an overview of what we're thinking of doing for the rest of the season. We are going to be talking about Mark Twain.
Yep.
Which may surprise some people. May surprise people. What the heck does Mark Twain have to do in New York? It's actually quite interesting. We are probably going to be talking about Bigfoot at one point. Remember, we have a park in New York that's bigger than Yellowstone.
Yep.
And it is almost all forested and mountainous. So if you don't think New York could hide Bigfoot, you've never seen the Adirondacks.
Adirondacks, if you haven't,
And even without the Adirondacks, there is plenty of woods and places that Bigfoot could hide. So we'll be talking about Bigfoot. We are going to be also talking about something else from the Adirondacks that might be true, might not be true. It's a good story, though. It's called the Indian Lake Project.
There we are.
Yes, that's a very interesting one.
That's more of a mystery.
Yeah, that's more of a mystery. And I think we also have on there, we're going to get into the late 1800s, early 1900s, and talk about an assassination attempt. I shouldn't say attempt, it was successful, that happened in New York State. And we're going to be mentioning one of the most popular presidents. This wasn't the attempt on his life. But Roosevelt's going to be in there along with McKinley.
Teddy
Roosevelt, yes.
Bully.
I still think he's still one of the more popular presidents. I think the internet's actually made him more popular. Because the more you read on this guy, we're like, this can't be real. Oh my God, it is.
Yeah, fantastic.
So yeah, we'll be going over the assassination of McKinley and possibly going over, if not this season, later or in more detail, where Roosevelt was when he found out and why it's kind of an interesting. It's now a road you can take and revisit his famous ride that he had to undergo to become president. So that's just an idea of the stuff we're going to plan on talking about, but things may change. Sometimes we lose recordings. Sometimes we find something more interesting. I know just recently...
We changed up on a couple of episodes.
Yeah, just recently I found another tie to a famous serial case that happened in California that may have ties into Rochester. So who knows? I might research that one and go, hey, let's talk about that.
Right.
But these are what's planned, and I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of heads up on what we have planned this season. All right. I think that's enough for today.
All right. Yeah, thank you for listening to our ghastly podcast.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you for listening to Unearthly Upstate. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Patreon, and on our webpage. We are also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, Podbean, Google Podcasts, and CastBox. Please like, share, and review on your favorite platform. Unearthly Upstate is an Animator Liar production. The show is produced by Mari and Matt Manette, with purring provided by Honey and Lloyd. Research and writing by Mari Manette. Music is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 license. Unless otherwise stated in the episode, the places mentioned in the broadcast are not paid or contact us for any type of promotion. Please check out our webpage for credit and sources for the episode. Thank you.